amidst the rubble of an old abandoned barracks in the Polish countryside, covered by decades of dust, infiltration and silence, an aged envelope escaped oblivion. It was a cloudy autumn morning when Yannick, an amateur historian and passionate about World War II relics, was sifting through the remains of a former Soviet military operations center. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just traces, lost stories, any object that could tell what the war tried to erase. Among torn maps, rusty uniform buttons and pieces of broken tiles, he found a small metal box, barely noticeable under a pile of worm-eaten boards. When he opened it, he found documents irrelevant to many incomplete reports. Grocery lists, but at the bottom of the box, folded carefully, was a letter, an envelope yellowed with age, closed, with firm but clearly hurried handwriting. There was a name, Aleksandra Kowalska, and just below, a date, February 17, 1944. The handwriting indicated urgency, emotion. The paper was intact, sealed with a faded red tape, with no signs of having been tampered with. The sender's name was in the bottom corner, Private Marek Novak, nothing more. There was no official shipping stamp, just a note in the corner, priority deliver in person. Yannick felt a strange chill run down his spine. It wasn't just the discovery of an ancient object, but the feeling of holding something that belonged to the innermost parts of two souls who may have never met again. What else could a letter sealed for almost 80 years mean? He didn't open it at that time. He respected the mystery. Instead, he took a photo, put the envelope in a protective bag, and took it with him. That night, at home, he placed the letter on the table and looked at it for long minutes. I wanted to open it. I wanted to understand, but there was something sacred about that paper. What if it was a goodbye, a request for forgiveness, a promise made hastily before a battle? Curiosity overcame fear. With extreme care, he broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet, written in Polish, in strong, almost trembling strokes. The words spoke of love, longing, and a future that the author feared he would not live. "If this letter reaches you, it is because something prevented me from returning," said the beginning. It was clear that Marek was writing from the front, perhaps in the last days of his life. But why had that letter never been delivered? Yannick immersed himself in the investigation. Discovering who Marek, Novak, and Aleksandra Kowalska were became a personal mission. Something in that letter touched him irrevocably. He needed to understand what happened. She needed to know if Aleksandra waited for her. I needed to know if Marek came back. In military records accessible in online archives and documentation centers at the time, there were dozens of soldiers with similar names, but Yannick was meticulous. He analyzed battalions, compared dates and locations. Finally, he found a draft card. The same handwriting as the letter, Marek Novak, 23, assigned to the 3rd Infantry Regiment, missing in action in March 1944, near the Ukrainian border, and Aleksandra. No immediate clues. The surname was too common. But there was something that made him uneasy. The letter was not in a military post office, or with Marek's personal belongings. It was in a box of internal documents, in a barracks. That meant someone held her back, intentionally or through carelessness. Maybe out of fear, maybe because of chaos, or simply by fatality. The letter, Yannick thought, was a time capsule. More than that, it was a promise that never arrived. A love trapped between cracked walls, buried under the weight of history and oblivion. The next morning, he took the letter to a historical document preservation center. He made copies, made transcriptions, sent parts of the letter to translator friends and experts in civil records. I wanted to cross-check Aleksandra's name with files of marriages, deaths, censuses, any clue. A thread of truth that led to the woman who waited for an answer that never came. At that moment, Yannick didn't know yet, but he had just opened the first page of a story that, even after so many years, was still waiting to be told. A love story that resisted war, distance, time, and the cruel silence of a letter that the army never delivered. The name was simple, Aleksandra Kowalska. But in the midst of so many files, lost records and stories, forgotten by the bureaucracy of war, finding a destination based on a name and a letter was like trying to reconstruct a photograph from a single burnt fragment. Still, Yannick was determined. He felt, more than ever, that history was asking to be rescued, not only out of historical duty, but out of a respect that he himself could not explain. It was as if the unspoken pain of that letter had reached through the years and was now whispering directly to him. Aleksandra. He repeated it in a low voice, as if each time he said the name, he got a little closer to the truth. Had she received that letter? Probably not. The way it was stored, hidden, suggested that it had never reached its destination. But then, what had happened to her? Had he survived the war? Had I built a new life? Or, like many, would she have been swallowed up by the tragedy of a cruel time? Janek's first stop was the National Archives in Warsaw. There, he spent hours examining wartime civilian documents. I was looking for any Aleksandra. Kowalska registered between 1935 and 1950. It was too common a name, but one intersection caught his attention. One Aleksandra Kowalska, born in 1921, resident in the city of Radom, had worked as a volunteer nurse during the occupation. Among the documents, one particularly important fact: she had been temporarily transferred to an army hospital facility in February 1944, exactly the month in which Marek wrote the letter. Janek followed this path with the fervor of someone chasing an unfulfilled promise. He traveled to Radom, looked for churches, registry offices, old neighbors. He asked carefully, with respect, as if each question was a prayer asking for answers. He discovered, after several failed attempts, that Aleksandra had, in fact, lived there. She was a nurse during the conflict, and then a teacher at a primary school until her retirement in the 1980s. She died in 1997, without children. And one more touching detail: he never married. Hearing this, Janek felt a lump in his throat. The silence of that letter began to echo louder. Had she waited until the end for Marek? Did she know about his disappearance? Or would I have just lived a life in suspense, waiting for an answer that never came? Janek got the address of Aleksandra's old house. It was a simple wooden house, already abandoned and about to be demolished. He asked the city for permission to enter and search the site, explaining that he was conducting historical research. Inside the house, an atmosphere of frozen time. The faded curtains still hung in the windows. The furniture was covered in dust. In one of the rooms, on an old dressing table, there was a wooden box. Inside, letters, lots of letters, and among them, a recurring name, Marek. Most of the letters were written by Aleksandra. They were drafts, letters that were never sent. Letters dated between 1944 and 1947. In them, she talked about her daily life, her hope of seeing him again, her dreams and pains. He spoke of war, of longing, of absence. They were letters filled with love and loneliness. There was one in particular, from 1945, in which she wrote, "If you're still alive, look for me. I still live in the same place. I still sleep waiting for the sound of your footsteps at the door." That woman had written for years, even without a response. It was as if, by writing, she was keeping Marek's presence alive. As if, without even knowing it, his soul refused to accept the end. With shaking hands, Janek photographed each letter, catalogued each document. He took some of the material to a local museum, which quickly became interested in the story. But more than that, he felt like he had been chosen for something bigger, picking up the pieces of a love that the war tried to silence. Back in Warsaw, Janek began writing an article, but he realized that one article would not be enough. He needed to tell this story in a way that others felt it too, that they realized that, amid statistics and battles, there were people, there were hearts. Marek was missing in action. Aleksandra, although a survivor, had experienced the war in another way, as a prisoner of an absence. The letter, the true story of the letter, was beginning to be revealed, and Janek was willing to go all the way. War is, above all, a machine for erasing names, faces, and stories. Between bombs and strategies, between victories and defeats, what is lost most are memories, those small, personal narratives that were never written, but were lived with all the intensity of a human heart. Marek and Aleksandra's story was one of those, buried among wreckage, surviving only in words that were never delivered and feelings that never found rest. After discovering Aleksandra's old home and the letters she never sent, Janek became restless. Something about him had changed. Before, he was just a researcher of other people's memories. Now, he felt tasked with rebuilding it. And, in doing so, he began to realize how fragile memories are in the face of time and neglect. Marek Novak, soldier, young, passionate, missing in action. That's all the files said. one name among thousands that disappeared in the muddy fields of Eastern Europe. Official military records were limited to one mention. Missing on March 12, 1944, last known location, Hubiesho forests. No body found, no testimony, no burial, just a formalized absence. How many mothers, how many women, how many children did not even have the right to cry over a grave? How many letters like that have been lost, retained, torn up, forgotten? How many loves died before they even knew they had been loved? Aleksandra's house revealed much more than sketches. In a small wooden cabinet, hidden behind a false wall, Yannick found a diary. There, in a sincere and painful way, she recorded the years after the war, the days of uncertainty, the empty meetings, the promises that weren't kept. And through it all, Marek remained a constant presence, almost ghostly, but incredibly real. He promised me he would come back. Maybe he did, only in thought, she wrote in 1950. Yannick read each page as if passing through a dense fog. This wasn't just history, it was a lament, an echo, a life shaped by waiting. Aleksandra had lived at the same address until the end. He refused to sell the house, move, rebuild somewhere else. He kept the furniture where it was, the portraits on the walls, and the bed always made for two. It was as if, every day, she feared that Marek would return and no longer find her there. As if, even without real hope, she still believed that destiny could correct itself. But fate did not correct itself, and the letter, that one letter, was perhaps all that was left of him. The last attempt to be present, to be remembered. The last chance to say, I haven't forgotten you. And yet, Aleksandra didn't even have that. Someone held her back. Someone or some structure prevented those words from reaching her. And with that, he erased a chance for reconciliation with his own pain. Yannick began to understand that Marek and Aleksandra's story was not an isolated case. He began visiting archives in other regions, reading reports from combatants, listening to survivors. He discovered that among Soviet and Polish fighters, it was common for personal letters to be confiscated when the situation at the front worsened. Many commanders feared that words of despair or sadness would affect the morale of families and the civilian population. Thousands of pieces of correspondence never left the barracks. Many were burned. Some, like Marek's, were simply forgotten. Forgetting, Yannick realized, is a powerful weapon. It does not destroy with violence, it destroys with silence. It was then that he decided to make the story public. He published an article in a small Warsaw newspaper. Within days, he was contacted by dozens of readers who told similar stories. Some remembered letters that never arrived, others of promises that disappeared. Along with the trains of soldiers, it was as if Yannick had suddenly awakened something bigger, a collective memory that was fighting to not disappear. In the last line of the article, he wrote, "The war took Marek, silence took Aleksandra. But maybe if we tell their story, we can rescue them from oblivion, even if just for a moment." And that moment was already happening. The story of that letter, of the letter that the army never delivered, began to touch other lives, not because of great, heroic deeds, but because of the simplicity of a love that resisted, even in silence. He left, like so many others, with the uniform on his shoulders, his eyes restless and his heart divided between duty and love. Marek Novak was no different from other young men of his generation. Young, idealistic, and passionate, he believed he would return not just alive, but in one piece, with the medal on his chest and Aleksandra's hug waiting for him at the station. But war, relentless, does not always return those it takes, and when it does, it is often only on paper, in cold records, without a body, without a face, without a soul. When he was summoned, Marek did not protest. He knew that, as a Pole under occupation, conscription was both an imposition and an inescapable fate. However, there was something about him that hurt more than the idea of death itself. Leaving without being able to assure Aleksandra that everything would be okay. She cried silently, holding his hands tightly, as if that would stop them from separating. "I'll be back before spring ends," he promised, trying to smile. She believed, or he pretended to believe it, so as not to tear him apart even more. Spring has passed, summer too. Autumn arrived, bringing only wind and silence. No letter, no news, no clues. What Aleksandra didn't know was that, even amid the chaos, Marek was trying to keep his promise. In February 1944, hiding behind the trenches on the Eastern Front, he wrote the letter. A long, emotional letter in which he spoke of fear, longing, and above all hope. If I don't make it back, this letter is all that will be left of me. And I want you to know, I chose you every day, even the worst. The soldier who never returned had a name, he had a face, he had love, but it disappeared. And disappearing, in a war, is a fate more cruel than death. The body is not found. The family cannot cry over a grave. Time does not close the wound, it just deepens it. Yannick, the historian who had discovered the letter so many years later, delved into accounts of the fighting in Hubieszo, where Marek was last seen. Reports were scarce. Soviet troops faced fierce German resistance in the region. Many were killed and left behind. Others were captured and never recorded again. There was no way to be sure what happened to Marek. But one thing seemed clear. He didn't defect. He didn't run away. He didn't betray. He was swallowed up by the battlefield like so many others. And his story, like that of thousands, was reduced to a line in a military document. Aleksandra, in turn, lived decades between grief and doubt. There was never confirmation of death, nor signs of life. Marek's portrait remained on her dresser until the end, and every his birthday, she lit a candle, like someone still waiting, like someone who refuses to let go. Time did not bring answers, but it brought a silence so profound that in itself it became an answer. But what if the letter had arrived? That was the question Yannick couldn't get out of his head. What if Aleksandra had read those words in 1944? Would I have moved forward more lightly? Would I have let love go with gratitude and not with anguish? Would there have been peace? Because there is a huge difference between losing someone and not knowing what happened. The war didn't just take Marek, it took Aleksandra the chance to say goodbye, to know, to feel that she had been loved until the end. It also took the possibility of honoring that love, with the certainty that it was not in vain. Yannick started to write everything down. The discoveries, the reports, the story of the letter, Aleksandra's feelings in the diaries, the searches in the archives. He decided that the story needed to be told, not as a historical story, but as a living memory. Because Marek wasn't just a soldier who didn't return. He was a man I loved, a man who wanted to return, a man whose last attempt to exist was written on a sheet of paper kept for decades among the ruins. And perhaps that was the most moving thing of all. Even though he was forgotten by official history, Marek resisted in love. His last action was not military, but emotional. His last battle was against oblivion. And now, through the hands of a stranger, his voice echoed again. If this story has touched your heart so far, if you have also felt the weight of waiting, of absence, and of the promise that could never be fulfilled, then I ask you something very simple, but very important. Leave a like on this video. This helps us move forward with stories that can no longer be forgotten. And if you believe that loves like Marek and Aleksandra deserve to be remembered, subscribe to the channel now. By subscribing, you help us keep alive every memory that was once silenced by war. Your support transforms this project into a bridge between past and present. A bridge where your every gesture helps to rebuild stories, restore voices, and do justice to those who only wanted to love, even I. Impossible times, and what comes next is even more exciting, because in the next chapter, you will find out what happened to her, Aleksandra, the woman who waited a lifetime for a letter that never arrived. You will see how silence shaped his life, and how the reappearance of that single sheet of paper, so many years later, was able to reopen wounds, but also bring answers. Don't miss it. Take a deep breath, and come with me. Aleksandra Kowalska didn't know that would be the last time she would see Marek when he left. There were no heroic promises or words embellished with bravery. There was, yes, a silent delicacy in his eyes, a request for forgiveness in advance, as if he already knew he couldn't keep his promise to return. And she, with her heart in pieces, held on tight enough not to beg him to stay. Because loving, at that time, also meant knowing how to let go, even without knowing if there would be a return. The following days were torpor. Aleksandra kept the routine as best she could. He worked at the military hospital in Radom, caring for the wounded, helping with medicine, cleaning up blood, and listening to the nightly groans of those who had lost, more than limbs they had lost hope. But every night, when he came home, he waited. I was waiting for a sign, a letter, a ticket, a whisper of fate that said Marek was alive. Nothing came. The months passed like a thick fog. February turned into March. March turned into April. In June, she heard about heavy fighting in the Hrubieszo region. His chest froze. It was the place where Marek was stationed. From then on, Aleksandra started searching for any information. He discreetly asked colleagues, wrote letters to local authorities, searched for names on public lists of survivors and missing people. But in return, he only received silence. A cruel, harsh silence that became more unbearable every day. Aleksandra didn't know if Marek had died or if he was simply trapped somewhere, unable to write. His head, the scenarios varied each week. He could have been captured, injured, maybe he was recovering, maybe he had lost his memory, maybe he was alive, maybe he had forgotten about her. This last hypothesis was the one that hurt her the most, but also the one that, deep down, she could never believe. Because Marek wasn't that kind of man. He loved completely. And even in the fear, there was tenderness in his promise. Still, the days piled up, and reality imposed itself like a shadow. At 1946, with the war already over, Aleksandra still had no answers. Neither official nor unofficial. Nothing. Marek's file was listed as missing in action. There was no body. There was no farewell letter. And more than that, there wasn't even the chance of a goodbye. It was as if he had evaporated into thin air, as if everything they had experienced had been a dream interrupted by an endless nightmare. Waiting, for Aleksandra, was not a temporary state. It was a permanent condition. She organized her life around it. He refused invitations to go out, to meet new people, to try again. Not because it was bitter. On the contrary, Aleksandra was sweet, polite, dedicated. But there was a space inside her that no one could occupy. A room closed from the inside, where Marek still lived, whole and young, like the last time they saw each other. Over time, she learned to live with absence, but he never accepted it. In the city, she was known as the girl with the letter, even though no one knew what the letter was. She walked the streets calmly, attended church, taught children at the local school, and smiled a faint but distant smile, like someone who lives at peace with the world, but at war with themselves. She wrote diaries, letters, reflections. In all of them, Marek appeared as an invisible presence. It wasn't mourning, it was fidelity. A silent, unbreakable loyalty, not out of obligation, but out of conviction. She loved him, even without knowing if he still existed. And maybe that's why she never allowed herself to love another man. Because Marek, for her, was not replaceable. It was unique. And although his physical presence was absent, his memory was so vivid that Aleksandra couldn't, or wouldn't, make room for anyone else. It was this silence that shaped Aleksandra's life. A silence louder than any words. A silence that said he left, and, at the same time, he could still come back. She lived in this contradiction until the end. And even in her last days, when she was old, frail, and with compromised health, she still kept Marek's portrait in uniform on the wall. No one ever knew for sure what she saw when she looked at that photo. But many said that sometimes she smiled at him, like someone still waiting to hear footsteps at the door. Yannick, upon discovering all this in the records and reports of the community, felt an indescribable weight in his chest. It was as if Aleksandra's pain still lived in that place. As if every wall, every object, every unsent letter still held the energy of a woman who lived whole, even incomplete. And now, decades later, that letter, a sheet of paper that Aleksandra never read, but by which she lived as if she had read it. And that would change everything. It was hard to believe that something as small as an envelope could carry so much weight. And yet, there it was, the letter. A simple sheet of paper yellowed with age, carefully folded, sealed with a bow of faded red ribbon. A relic that had passed through generations, forgotten in a metal box, protected by nothing but chance. For almost 8 decades, it remained stored in the dark, among the rubble of a barracks that no longer existed in anyone's imagination, except the weather. It was Yannick who found her, an amateur historian guided more by intuition and heart than by scientific methods. He scoured ruins looking for objects that could tell forgotten stories of the Second World War, but he never imagined that among the shards and debris, he would discover an undelivered personal message, a love story frozen in time. The letter was intact, with no signs of tampering. Aleksandra Kowalska's name was written in dark, firm ink on the front of the envelope. The calligraphy had personality, emotion. In the bottom corner, the sender's name, Marek Novak, and below, the date, February 17, 1944. The letter was not sealed with an official stamp. It was marked personal delivery. That meant Marek had intended to hand her over himself, or perhaps had entrusted someone else to do so. But that wasn't what happened. For weeks, Yannick hesitated to open it. Something in him said that piece of paper didn't belong to him. It was too intimate. It carried promises, words that should have reached specific eyes, a special heart. But Aleksandra was no longer alive. And if he didn't read it, perhaps that message would be lost forever. After all, it was more than a letter. It was a last testimony of love. When he finally opened it, with trembling and almost solemn hands, reading the first line was enough to make time break in half. If this letter reached you, it is because something prevented me from returning. Those words were not just the beginning of a letter. They were the end of a life, a cycle, a hope. Marek had written with an open heart, talking about his memories with Aleksandra, the plans they had together, the fear that there wouldn't be enough time to fulfill everything they promised. But the letter never arrived, and love remained suspended, without end, without response. Upon understanding the depth of that message, Yannick felt he had a mission. Not just tell the story, but bring it back to life. And the first step was to understand why it was never delivered. He scoured military archives, campaign mail records, battalion reports. It turned out that Marek was reported missing in action in March 1944, a month after writing the letter. His platoon faced an unexpected attack, and many soldiers were killed or captured. Documents were scarce, but everything suggested that Marek was one of the victims of the confrontation in Hrubieszow. But how did the letter end up in that barracks, so many kilometers away from the front line? That answer might never be discovered. It could have been handed over to a trusted officer, or forgotten with Marek's belongings that were sent back to command. Or worse, it may have been purposely withheld, part of a cruel policy that vetoed emotional messages so as not to demoralize soldiers' families. Regardless, the letter had survived, and now it was in the hands of someone who understood its value. Yannick decided that Marek and Aleksandra's memory would no longer be ignored. Their story needed to be told. He started by writing short texts on a personal blog, then published a detailed article in a history magazine. The impact was immediate. People from all over the country got in touch with him, reporting similar situations: lost letters, silenced loves, incomplete stories. Marek's letter became a symbol of something greater, of the invisible wound that the war left on so many souls. He then did something even braver. He organized a small exhibition in Radom, titled "The Love That War Almost Erased." There, the letter was displayed in a glass case, alongside copies of Aleksandra's letters, her young portrait, her diary, and Marek's personal effects rescued from the archives. Visitors left emotional, some in tears. It was as if, finally, that letter had fulfilled its destiny, touching the hearts of those who still believe that love, even when interrupted, never dies. And for Yannick, the letter represented more than a historical find. It was a reminder that there is no distance, time, or war capable of erasing what is true. The letter didn't arrive in 1944, but it arrived now. And sometimes, even if it's too late, it's still time to feel. Yannick was neither a hero nor a renowned scholar. He was just an ordinary man, passionate about stories and the memory that survives the rubble of time. At age 42, he divided his days between working as an archivist at a municipal library and his solitary explorations of abandoned sites from the Second World War. He wasn't looking for fame or recognition. What moved Yannick was the feeling that each old piece of paper, each forgotten photograph, carried within it an entire life waiting to be remembered. That was how, on an ordinary day, amid the dust of a deactivated barracks, he found the letter. At first, he didn't understand the weight of what he had in his hands. He thought it was just another military document or a common letter among many. But when he noticed the care with which it was written, the name of the recipient, the absence of any sign of delivery, something inside him woke up. It was as if that letter had chosen him. In the following days, Yannick could think of nothing else. He slept little, read excerpts from the letter repeatedly, and scribbled notes in notebooks. His wife Marta said he was obsessed but understood. After all, she knew the sensitive heart her husband carried. Yannick had never been able to bear stories with inconclusive endings. Since I was a child, I cried when a character in a book left and didn't come back. Maybe that's why that letter had moved him so deeply, because it wasn't fiction, it was real, and someone, at some point, had waited for those words. The investigation began with the most obvious roots: the name on the envelope, Aleksandra Kowalska, and the date, February 1944. Janek accessed public records, old certificates, lists of residents. He discovered that Aleksandra had lived in Radom, a medium-sized town a few hours away, and that she had worked as a nurse during the war. The most impressive thing, however, was knowing that she never married. She lived alone until she died in 1997, leaving no children. It was as if I had been waiting not just for a man, but for an explanation. Little by little, what was curiosity became commitment. Janek felt he owed both of them to Marek, who had written a letter believing it would be read, and to Aleksandra, who had lived her life without knowing that someone, on some battlefield, was still thinking about her. The search for Marek was more difficult. There were dozens of records with similar names, but one detail helped him: the handwriting of the letter. Crossing handwritten documents from soldiers, he found an enlistment file that had the same strong, slightly slanted handwriting. The name Marek Novak, soldier of the 3rd Infantry Regiment, assigned to the Eastern Front. Final record: missing in action, March 1944. The story was beginning to form. Marek had written the letter a month before he disappeared. It had never been sent. Aleksandra never knew, and the world continued as if nothing had happened. But Janek wasn't about to let it end like that. He returned to the house where Aleksandra had lived. The property still existed, uninhabited, at risk of demolition. With authorization from local authorities, he entered and searched the place for any traces. And there, he found more than he expected: an old trunk, containing drafts of letters that Aleksandra had written to Marek. There were pages and pages of love, pain, hope and longing, all guarded jealously, as if he still hoped to be able to send them one day. Janek then understood that Aleksandra's life had been shaped by that absence, that Marek was not an occasional memory, but a permanent presence. She had lived, not as a widow, but as a betrothed to a man whom fate had taken from her, and he never stopped believing he could come back. It was holding those letters, with the shaky handwriting of someone who wrote to endure the emptiness, that Janek made a decision. He would tell that story to the world, not for glory, not for recognition, but because it was right, because there was real love there, the kind that doesn't end with time, and because, even without ever meeting again, Marek and Aleksandra had remained linked by a letter that the army never delivered. But that chance, or perhaps something greater, had finally placed in the hands of someone willing to listen to it. From that point on, Janek was no longer just the man who found the letter. He had become the guardian of a story, and he was willing to follow it to the end. The name Aleksandra Kowalska alone was not enough. As Janek soon discovered, it was one of the most common surnames in Poland. There were hundreds of Aleksandras in civil records at the time, many born around the 1920s, many living in small towns, many with stories that, perhaps, would never be told. But that Aleksandra was different. She had been the recipient of a letter that had waited nearly 80 years to be read. Janek knew this with a certainty that came not just from the documents, but from something much deeper, a silent link between what was lost and what finally wanted to be found. The definitive clue emerged in the archives of the Radom Military Hospital. Aleksandra was listed as a volunteer nurse from 1943 to 1945. One document in particular caught my attention: a temporary transfer form to the Eastern Front, dated February 1944, the same month as the letter. She had been sent to an emergency care station close to the front line, in the Hrubieszo region, where Marek served. That couldn't be a coincidence. Heart-racing Janek took detailed notes. With each new piece of information, Aleksandra's figure gained more shape. She was no longer just a name on an envelope. She was a real woman, who had crossed paths with the man who wrote those words with so much love and fear. He then searched residential records. He located Aleksandra's last address, on a quiet street in Radom, where she lived until her death in 1997. The house, as she already knew, was uninhabited, but old neighbors still remembered her. A white-haired lady named Zofia opened the door, suspiciously, but changed her expression as soon as she heard the name. Miss Kowalska, of course, I remember. A very reserved woman, kind but sad. Zofia said that Aleksandra never married. She spent her days reading, writing, and tending a small garden at the back of the house. He never talked about his youth, but everyone knew he had lost someone in the war. I never said who I was. He never cried in public. He just lived with a calm that, to outsiders, looked like resignation. But for Yannick, this was the very definition of ongoing grief, a mourning without an end. The lady allowed him to enter the house. Even after years of closure, the place still maintained the atmosphere of those who lived there. There were books lined up on the shelves, old furniture, curtains yellowed with age. In the bedroom, on a wooden table, there was a picture frame facing downwards. Yannick lifted her. It was a photo of Marek in uniform. On the back, handwritten, just that. With the permission of municipal authorities, Yannick had access to documents left by Aleksandra. In a trunk, he found dozens of letters written between 1944 and 1947, all addressed to Marek. They were attempts to keep alive what was disappearing. Each of them began with the same tone, a mixture of hope, pain, and longing. In some, she described the day. In others, your dreams. In all of them, the lack of response was a hidden character. One letter, dated November 1946, said, "Sometimes I hear footsteps on the sidewalk, and I think it's you. But it's not. It wasn't yesterday. It won't be today. But I write anyway, as if I could reach you. Because if I stop, it's as if I accept that you won't come back. And I'm not ready for that." It tore Yannick up inside. Because now, he had in his hands the letter she had been waiting for so long. He read the requests, the pleas, the outbursts, and knew that, in 1944, Marek had responded. Except that answer never reached her. It was then that Yannick traced his journey as a reverse timeline. Marek's letter led him to Aleksandra. Her writings now took him back to him. Every name, every piece of data, every clue fit together with almost supernatural precision. It was as if fate itself was guiding Yannick's steps, page by page, memory by memory. What's more, when sharing the story with the local history museum, he discovered that Marek Novak's name was on an incomplete list of missing people whose personal belongings were never handed over to their families. Among the items was a metal box, the same one Yannick found in the barracks. In other words, the letter was archived, not lost, stolen by institutional oblivion, silenced by a war that decided which stories were worth telling and which could be left behind, but not anymore. Now, with the pieces put together, Yannick knew the time had come to tell everything, to unite what the war separated, and to give a voice to the woman who waited, and to the man who, until his last moment, tried to return. There are moments when time seems to bow before a story, not to erase it, but to allow it to finally be lived, even if belatedly, even if in a symbolic way. For Yannick, the moment he held Marek's letter in front of Aleksandra's grave was one of those moments. A fusion of what was and what could have been, an unlikely reunion between two worlds separated by war, but united by something stronger, the word that survived oblivion. It was on a cloudy morning that Yannick arrived at the Radam cemetery. The tombstone was simple, discreet, like the woman who rested there. Engraved in cold stone, it said, Aleksandra Kowalska, -1921 to 1997. She lived in hope. No mention of children, husband, family, just that phrase. He lived with hope, as if his entire existence could be summed up in silent waiting for an outcome that never came. Yannick remained there for long minutes. I didn't say anything, just watched. He listened to the sound of leaves in the wind, the whisper of trees, the silence of the graves around him. Then, with careful hands, he took a carefully laminated envelope from his pocket. It was the letter, the one Marek had written more than 80 years ago, the one Aleksandra never read. He wasn't sure what to do. Part of him wanted to bury her there, as a symbolic gesture of completion. Another part wanted to place it on the tombstone, as if he were finally giving away what time had denied him. But deep down, Yannick understood that none of that was necessary. Aleksandra was gone. And, even without reading Marek's words, he had lived as if he had felt them. She didn't need the letter to know she was loved. She knew. I always knew. But the world needed to know. And that was why he was there. The reunion with the past was not limited to that cemetery. Yannick organized an intimate ceremony at the local museum, where the Letters That the War Silenced exhibition would officially open. In the main room, a glass dome housed Marek's letter, now preserved as a reliquary of what is indestructible, love that resists time. Beside her were some of Aleksandra's letters, excerpts, enlarged on delicately lit panels, and, at the back of the room, the two photographs, Marek in his uniform, smiling with the shyness of someone who loves too much, Aleksandra with her sweet eyes, looking beyond the camera, as if looking for someone. The inauguration was silent, almost ceremonial. Some historians, former residents of the city, and even young students were present. Many cried, Silence. Others left flowers next to the display. But everyone, without exception, was touched by something difficult to explain, a feeling that they were participating in a reckoning with time. Janek gave a short speech. It was not a historical lecture, but a tribute. This letter should have been delivered in 1944, but it was only found in the following century. All these years, Aleksandra lived as if that answer was on the way, and now she has arrived. There's no changing what happened. There is no way to return Marek, nor undo the war. But you have to remember, and by remembering, we do justice. Not to the great generals, but to the anonymous hearts that also fought for love, for hope, for a simple letter that never arrived. History went beyond the museum walls. Within a few days, the local press covered the exhibition, and the report reached national television. People from all over the country started visiting the space. Many began looking for their own war stories. Letters forgotten in attics, old unidentified photographs, documents with deleted names. It was as if Marek and Aleksandra's story had opened a collective wound, but also an opportunity for healing. The past, after all, was not just something to be studied. It was something to be felt, understood, and, when possible, reconciled. Janek knew that nothing he did would bring Marek back or change Aleksandra's fate. But, somehow, by uniting their voices, even if late, he had built a bridge between two hearts separated by the noise of the world. And in doing so, he gave back to both of them what was denied them, the right to be remembered not as victims of a war, but as protagonists of a love story, a story that was almost lost. She never knew what he wrote. He never held the envelope in his hands, never read the words hastily drawn by a young man amid the smell of gunpowder and mud. He never felt the touch of the still fresh ink on the paper, nor the tremor contained between the lines of a man he loved and feared, at the same time, of not returning. But now we know. When Janek finally read the letter in full, sitting at the table in his home, with teary eyes and a pounding heart, he realized that what he had in his hands was not just military correspondence, but the last silent cry of a love that did not want to die on the battlefield. It was a confession, a farewell, a vow for eternity made with simple, human, deeply real words. The letter began with the uncertainty of someone who doesn't know if they will have another chance. Alexander, if this letter reached you, it is because something prevented me from returning. Maybe it's too early to say this. Maybe you're still waiting to hear my voice, not read my words. But I'm writing because I need to make clear what I might not be able to say in person. There was no unnecessary drama. There was sincerity. Marek spoke of longing, of the growing fear in the days before the combat, of the way her eyes appeared. His thoughts whenever silence fell between one bombardment and another. And he continued, I think of you when I see the clear sky, when the wind touches my face and reminds me of the last day we were together. I didn't want to leave. I would have given anything to stay another afternoon by your side, even if it was the last. But I was called, and I couldn't run away from it. What comforts me is knowing that you were waiting for me, and I hope, with all my heart, that you're still waiting for me. Janek had to stop reading for a few seconds. It was as if he heard Marek's voice reading aloud, not with the intonation of a soldier, but with that of a man who knew he was writing his last words. Further on, Marek addressed something that few dared to talk about in times of war: regret. I wish I had told you I loved you more often. I wish I had written more letters. I wish I had asked you to marry me before I left, but I thought I would have time. And now, every beat of my heart seems to say that time is not something we can control. The words became more intimate, more fragile. It was as if, at the end of the letter, Marek was closer to surrendering not to the enemy, but to the possibility of never meeting her again. And then he wrote what Janek considered to be the heart of the entire message: if I don't come back, don't live in the dark. Live for me. Love again, if you can. But no story will ever be the same as ours. Because what we experienced was true. You made me believe that, even in the midst of war, love was still possible. And that, Aleksandra, is more than any medal I could receive." In the last line of the letter, a sigh transformed into words. "I loved you until the end. And wherever I am, I still love you." He signed with a simple Marek. It was everything. There were no dramatic requests, no eternal vows that sounded too poetic for reality. It was love in its purest form, vulnerable, imperfect, human. A love that knew it could die at any moment, but that didn't want to disappear without leaving something behind. Something that said, "I existed. I loved you. I wanted to come back." Yannick finished reading in silence. Marek's words still echoed in the room, as if they had finally found air after decades of suffocation. The emotion I felt was not just as a reader, but as a witness. He understood, now more than ever, the impact that letter would have had on Aleksandra's life, how much it would have comforted her, how much it would have freed her from the anguish of not knowing. And, ironically, she never read it. But maybe, Yannick thought, he didn't need to, because Aleksandra lived as if she had heard every word, as if she had felt every line being written. She didn't move on, but she didn't stop loving either. She lived in the gap between hope and resignation, and that, in itself, was the answer. Now the whole world could hear Marek. Now the letter was alive. Aleksandra never knew what Marek had written. He ever received the envelope, never saw the red ribbon, never read the sentence that said, "I loved you until the end." But in a way, she lived as if she had read every line of that letter. And perhaps that's why her most genuine reaction to Marek's absence was not despair, but the choice for a silent and dignified wait, as if love had frozen time around her heart. She didn't cry in public. He didn't look for frantic answers. He did not visit military posts or hospitals, begging for information. Instead, Aleksandra created an internal refuge where Marek remained alive. It was there that she retreated on long nights, on special dates, on lonely winters. A place where time didn't advance, where shared smiles didn't fade, and where the last image of him in uniform, with teary eyes, saying "I'll be back," remained intact. Upon discovering, decades later, the letters that Aleksandra wrote to Marek between 1944 and 1947, Yannick realized that this was not just a prolonged lament. They were true dialogues with the absent. She talked about her daily life, about the spring that arrived early that year, about the children at school, about the longing she felt in her chest, but also about the certainty that, somewhere, he was thinking about her. "Today the flowers in the field grew again. I remembered how you laughed when I talked to them. You said I looked like a child, but that's how I loved you, simply, without fear." Unsent letter, April 1945. These letters were confessions, but they were also reactions not to what Marek said, but to what she believed he had said. Aleksandra lived as if she had received a promise that was unfulfilled, but never forgotten. Like someone who interpreted silence as a sign, not abandonment, she reacted to his disappearance with a rare type of courage, that of continuing to love without guarantees. On the walls of his house, he kept a portrait of him for years, already yellowed, protected by a simple frame. She told her few friends that she was a distant relative, so she wouldn't have to explain something she didn't even know. But at night, before going to sleep, he would sit in front of the photograph and speak quietly. It was a prayer, a conversation with someone who might already be on the other side, or not. A neighbor of a generation marked by loss, Aleksandra became a discreet symbol of emotional resistance. Never married, she has never been seen with another man. He received letters from childhood friends. He responded with affection, but his sentimental life remained untouched, not out of bitterness, but out of choice. The same choice I made every day when walking to the train station on Sunday mornings, as if I still expected to see him get off some carriage. When he died in 1997, his room was largely intact. The curtains were washed, the books were lined up, the diary was open on the table, and a candle was lit in front of Marek's portrait. The flame is almost out, but still present, just like the love she had for him, subtle, constant, resistant. Yannick, when reconstructing this trajectory, felt something he had never experienced so deeply, empathy for someone he had never met. He often wondered what would have happened if the letter had been delivered, if Aleksandra, reading Marek's words, had felt the relief of truth, the comfort of love reciprocated even from a distance. Would I have moved on? Would I have loved again? Would you have lived any other way? But by reading his diaries, Yannick found the answer. In one of the last entries, dated 1990, Aleksandra wrote, "Today I dreamed that he was coming back. He was older, with wrinkles in his eyes, but the same smile. I didn't ask where he had been, I just hugged him. And he said, 'It took me a while, but I came. Maybe it's just a dream, but sometimes I think it's enough, because in the dream, I knew he loved me.'" Aleksandra reacted to the absence, not with despair, but with tenderness, and even without the letter, she lived each day as if Marek had left an invisible but constant message between the lines of destiny. Now, with the story public, with the letter finally revealed, perhaps his life would gain a new light, because the love she felt, and the way she lived it, was now known. And somehow, she had finally received the answer she had been waiting for a lifetime. The letter never reached Aleksandra. She lived and died unaware of the words Marek wrote to her in his final days, words filled with love, fear, and truth. However, even though he hadn't fulfilled the destiny that Marek imagined, that letter would still change everything. Not in the traditional way, not like a reunion or a fresh start, but as a revelation that would transform pain into legacy, silence into voice, and oblivion into living memory. When Yannick went public with Marek and Aleksandra's story, something extraordinary began to happen. It wasn't just people's curiosity about a love interrupted by war. It was the way the narrative touched something collective, almost universal. The letter revealed a truth that everyone, at some point in their life, experiences: the love that is lost before finding its outcome, the feeling that doesn't die, but also has nowhere to go, a suspended love. For many, history acted as a mirror. People began sending Yannick messages, telling similar stories, grandparents who waited for someone who never came back, letters discovered in old trunks, memories that only made sense decades later. Letter, forgotten for 80 years, had become a conduit for other memories to resurface. And with that, silent healings began to happen. But it wasn't just the public that changed. Yannick has also changed. Before the letter, he was just a lover of old files, a curious one, someone who saw history as a series of events to be cataloged. After the letter, he began to see history as a living body, made up of affections, losses, and rescues. The exhibition he organized at the museum was expanded. It received contributions from people who brought their own old letters, uniforms, and personal belongings. The room that previously displayed only Marek's letter now contained a collection of broken silences. It was as if, by giving voice to one couple's story, Yannick had opened space for many others to speak as well. And there was, mainly, a change in the way people looked at Aleksandra. She was no longer seen as a lonely woman who waited for someone in vain. Now, it was understood as a symbol of fidelity, tenderness, and emotional resistance. His waiting came to be seen not as an act of weakness, but as a testimony of love that transcends time. Marek's words, revealed to the world even after her death, proved that she expected nothing, she expected everything, for someone who, in fact, loved her, even though she couldn't come back. The letter also changed everything in the way war is understood, because it revealed another type of tragedy, one that does not erupt in explosions or bullets, but in silence. The war didn't just kill people, it killed conversations, interrupted sentences, silenced letters, and Marek's was one of those. She was suffocated by a bigger gear, by a policy that saw love as weakness, longing as distraction. But now, decades later, she was finally breathing. A new generation was touched by the story. Teachers began to use the letter in literature, history, and philosophy classes. Students wrote essays inspired by Marek and Aleksandra's love. A theater group performed the story in a public square in Warsaw. And amidst all this, a simple phrase, taken from the last line of the letter, became a motto for many. "I loved you until the end." The phrase was printed on paintings, embroidered on scarves, marked on the skin of those who decided to immortalize the memory of this love, not as a fad, but as a tribute, a reminder that even without happy endings, love still counts, even if it doesn't last long, even if you don't get an answer. And then, the impossible happened. A distant relative of Marek's great-nephew, the son of a brother who had also fought in the war, contacted Yannick. He didn't know about the letter, nor about Aleksandra's story, but when he saw the news, he recognized the surname and looked for family records. He sent a photograph of a younger Marek, taken before the war, and confirmed that there was, indeed, mention of a woman called Aleksandra in the conversations his grandfather used to have. Nobody knew what happened between them, but after the war, Marek was never seen again. For Yannick, that sealed the story once and for all. The letter had not only revealed what had been lost, she had reconnected the loose threads of the past, restored dignity to the memory of two broken hearts, and proved that true love doesn't need to be lived to be eternal. Sometimes it just needs to be told. And now that the world knew Marek and Aleksandra, they were finally together, not in body, not in time, but in the memory of everyone who allowed themselves to feel. If this story touched you in any way, if throughout this video you remembered someone who left without saying goodbye, a love that was suspended in time, or felt in your heart the weight and beauty of what it means to truly love, then I invite you to be part of this mission. Subscribe to the channel. Here, each story told is a rescue of memory, a tribute to feelings that can no longer be silenced. Your support allows us to continue searching for these lost voices, these forgotten hearts, these truths that only time can reveal. And if you made it this far, I want you to comment, "Love survived," so that Marek and Aleksandra are never forgotten. Because as long as there are those who remember, no story truly dies.